Hello there, and welcome along to episode 2 of TGP Has a Podcast, where this week we will be talking about the season 22 of TGP2, arguably the greatest TGP2 season, ruined by its own title decider. My guests this week, we've got Owen Quimby, who joined me in the commentary box a lot that season, along with Jean, who also joined me a lot in the commentary box that season. Hello, gents.
All right.
Good afternoon.
So we've chosen this topic as there were some very good things to come from that season, but also some things which hung around in the TGP community for quite a while after, and still today. So I want to start, as we normally do, with just asking you both, what are your first thoughts when you think about season 21 of TGP2?
Well, first of all, I think that season was really, really competitive. Like we had, I think, the all-time TGP record for most winners in a season. I think we had about 11 of them. So that's like a winner every other race, pretty much. And was fiercely competitive throughout. We had a lot of different podium, like people on the podium, different winners, of course. But especially it kind of comes towards the fierce title fight between CJ and Luca.
Yeah, definitely that season finale brought up something interesting towards the end of the season. I agree with that. But yeah, definitely it was quite an interesting season. After 8 rounds, there was a 6-way title fight brewing between Luca, Erland, Joe, Dom, CJ and Barry. And then it kind of went on from there. 11 different winners that season. I think John might have mentioned that already. And it was just kept going from there. And it literally got very interesting towards the end of the season.
Yeah, it narrowed down quite nicely to the end. As you mentioned, after the first sort of 8 rounds, we had quite a few people in the running for it. And as the season progressed, Luca seemed to be on quite a charge, I think, from memory, racking up a few victories, but ended up missing a couple of rounds. And CJ made the most of it and got himself right in the title fight. So we really ended up with a very classic season in the end. And looking back on it, the action in each of the races as well were all very good, and there was, you honestly went into each round not knowing who was going to win. So it was unpredictable enough, but not too much that it was almost random. I think it had a good balance. Would you agree with that, guys?
Yeah, I think I'll definitely agree with that. It's a very interesting season, like you said. A lot of unpredictables coming from race to race. We didn't know who was going to win from race to race. Like one race, CJ would be the quickest guy. Next race, it'd be Luca. Then it'd be Erland. And then it just all kind of snowballed on from there.
And we also had it was the season with the Seiya Sports point system as well, from memory, where we had points down to the top 12. Maybe that helped out a little bit with the competitiveness. Do you reckon?
I think ultimately, yes, because, it meant that a few people a little lower down would get a few points here and there. If a, guy fighting for the championship had a bad round, he'd still be picking up a couple points if they get in around 11th or 12th, where normally you wouldn't have that at all with the standard 25, 18, 15 system for the top 10. So I think it did help a little bit. Guys picking up a few extra points here and there, which allowed them to keep in contact if they had a bad round, where in the past the amount of points they'd lose would be greater, so to speak.
Well, you mentioned there, if a championship contender has a bad round. I mean, I think in week 6, Luca only managed to pick up 6 points. So that meant he would have had to have finished at least 7th or lower in both those races. But, it's enough points to keep you on a bit of a momentum, but certainly nowhere near if your title rival is picking up 2 wins, say, and they're getting 50 or on 6. That's a 44-point swing there all of a sudden. And it makes a huge difference. But that said, you can still pick up a 12th and keep some momentum going.
Well, he also missed the following week as well, because he didn't start either race the next week, which didn't help with that matter as well.
No, certainly not. Well, we're going to, in this episode, focus more on the latter part of the season, where things really started to get juicy, shall we say, between the two title rivals. So the first 4 races going into there, CJ had opened up a lead to Luca, who had been championship leader for most of the season, I think, from memory. And he'd opened up a 31-point lead to Luca with 4 rounds to go. And then we went to Mexico, and towards the end of the race, it has been quite a good race, I think, from memory so far. And we had the title rivals battling on track. What more could you want?
Yeah, exactly. Not what more could you want? Title rivals battling hard, battling for the win. Well, for second place even at that point, as one of them was leading the pit lane.
Yeah, and John, I think from memory, there was some anticipation that things could get a little bit heated towards this part of the season. But what happened next with their encounter, shall we say? Did we quite expect that to happen? That far away from the season end already?
I think where we were with the title, we had CJ, he was 31 points clear, and Luca was just desperate to get every single point over him that he could. So I think it was where Luca was coming out the pit lane and he was coming out ahead, but CJ had the speed beating down the main straight, and Luca coming out the pits is on the right hand side of the circuit. CJ goes for the gap because there's a little gap forming, but Luca promptly just shuts the door on him. It's pretty much pushing CJ onto the edge of the track. It was firm. CJ was understandably furious with what happened, and as they got to turn one, Luca managed to stay ahead, running a bit wide, but holding on to the position and not gaining an advantage. So they stayed with Luca being in front of CJ, and that ultimately did help him close a little bit of the gap at the top.
Yeah, well, it's a 3-point increase. We had Speed Danskar, who was on pole position for that race. He ended up taking his first race win of the season at that point, which was really good for the Finnish driver. But as you said, those 3 points, suddenly, and I suppose it's that mentality as well of being in a title fight so close. I mean, if anyone's got anything to lose there, it's CJ. So did Luca exploit that a little bit by squeezing him on the main straight?
Possibly, but if you look back at the move, it was like one of them was coming out the pits. I think Luca kind of misjudged where they were on track, so he kind of gave him the squeeze. He thought he was probably behind him, didn't realise he was actually alongside, and that's why he ended up on the grass, CJ.
Also, where CJ's decided to commit to the inside, he had the whole of the track to the left of Luca that was there, and with the straight line advantage, Luca's still going down the pit exit. He can't cross the white line, so if CJ kind of kept his foot down, he probably would have got to the corner. While on the outside, he would have at very worst been side by side with Luca or slightly ahead, so it could have gone really differently. But I think it was a very risky manoeuvre that could have ultimately ended in disaster for both of them if any contact was made.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I mean, personally, from watching it at the time, I thought it was absolutely great racing. Here we are. We have two people absolutely going hell for leather. Rubbing's racing. Squeezing each other. To the point of contact. No inch being given. That's great racing, isn't it?
I think people would say that. I think ultimately it was decided that it was all within the rule book and no punishment was taken. So I think people did agree with that it was great racing. It was firm, it was on the limit, but it was ultimately legal and fair. So obviously Luca didn't get any punishment for it and ultimately kept P2 in that race and got the 3 points over CJ that closed the gap to 28.
So we saw Dan's car, as we said, go on to take the victory. Luca did pick up second after it was deemed he was within the rule book, and CJ finished third. It was his second third place in a row. So that's good enough, continuing the sort of the some momentum there for CJ, who was on the podium a lot that season as it was anyway. And he only, looking back at this point in the season, had only picked up 3 wins. Luca, meanwhile, was pushing on still at this point, had taken 6 wins. So in comparison, in wins basis, the consistency of CJ at this point had put him what was now 28 points ahead after this round. But it was Luca's, inconsistencies, maybe should we say, that was costing him at this point. But I'm looking through the top 3s for each of the races so far, and it's rare to see a race where CJ isn't in that.
So I'm just looking at it myself, and you can see like Luca had 6 wins, but in terms of other podiums up to that point, he'd only had 3, 1 second place and a couple of thirds. So he seemed to be quick, but was prone to a bit of inconsistency, which I think became sort of an advantage for CJ, I guess, because even though CJ only had the 3 wins, he was regularly getting third place or second place. I mean, just looking at it, he's had 5 second places to go with the 3 wins, as well as 4 third places. So he was consistently on the podium, while Luca, not so much.
Yeah,
and you could quite clearly see it. Second half of the season is where it really started to kick on consistency-wise with CJ. I think I could only really see about maybe 3 races where he didn't get a podium in the second half of the season.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, as we'll come on to, they're all within a sort of a cluster together, really. I mean, in sort of outright speed points at this point of the season, really, neither of them have been particularly good over one lap, which was, I think, paramount to just how close the season was. I mean, over the races that we've had so far, I can see Luca only taking 2 pole positions and CJ only having 3. So does that show then that although these two very differing driving styles and approaches to racing were in the end sort of deserving of the title, one of the two of them, by just being the class of the field at this point?
Well, I think there's a difference between quali pace and race pace. Like, you could be quick on a 1 lap, but if you don't have the consistency to do it over a race distance, what's the point?
Yeah, it's like if you look on the pole position list for the season, Bossman Sean, he had 6 pole positions. He had more than 2 of them CJ and Luca put together, but he never really converted it into wins. He actually converted it into accidents more often than not, where he'd overpush the limit. And, well, after Mexico came Brazil, so to speak.
Yes, and you rightly touched on accidents there. And this is probably where we have seen arguably one of the biggest incidents we've ever had in any TGP race. TGP 1, TGP 2, TGP cars, TGP dirt that we've had. So it's a wet Brazil, which always throws up a bit of an interesting one. We had Speed Down's car take his 2nd pole position in a row. We had both the title rivals in the top 5 in the grid. We had Bossman Sean in there as well. It was a very tricky start. There was a lot of traction issues. And after we come out of turn 3, all hell broke loose.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Sean, I think, did he start on pole that race? I can't remember.
Sean, I think, was on the front row from memory. It was Dan's car that was on pole.
Dan's car on pole, yeah. He had. So he was up the front, and he made a mistake early on, like he normally does when he starts near the front. He normally bottles it somehow. So he managed to cause a massive accident of huge proportions. I remember me and you just going absolutely mental on commentary over it.
Yeah. So as I'm just saying, both of us were on the commentary, and I think it was just shock more than anything, witnessing what was going on. So to put you a little bit more in the picture, if you haven't seen it, we'll put a link in the description for any of you who haven't seen the incident before. We've got Sean coming round turn 3. He loses the back end and he clips the wall on the exit of the pit. Now that spears him into Luca, title challenger Luca, who himself then gets pushed onto the AstroTurf on the outside of turn 3. He himself starts spinning, and then of all people that he could have hit, of all the grid of 15, 16 drivers, he hits CJ, and it puts CJ out on the spot. Luca damages his front wing, and then a lot of people behind have nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And
with what happened, obviously, Luca and CJ coming together, you just couldn't ride it, really. That massive pile up, loads of cars involved, and the two title contenders managed to find each other in the melee. Well, Luca was spinning until he got collected by CJ. CJ ultimately spun out. Luca got away with it, but CJ was sideways on the middle of the racing line, but I think behind it was one of the Williams just had absolutely nowhere to go and just speared straight into the side of the Renault of CJ and took him out of the race.
Unbelievable. I mean, when you watch back the incident again, it's almost tricky to think that this was happening at this late point of the season as well, involving two of the title rivals, and taking the championship leader out straight away. It was just, I wouldn't say it was difficult to sort of believe what was going on, but it was certainly shocking. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, looking back at it now, is Sean had dropped to fifth on the start. Yeah, like you said, just lost it completely and went completely across the field and all chaos ensued. And because the amount of DNFs there was what, 6 DNFs looking at it now. And CJ was one of them. But because there's so many DNFs, he still actually managed to pick up points from that race.
Yeah. And every car, man, being or somehow got involved in that. I think the thing that got me most was how there was almost a sort of secondary incident going on at the back, which is what caused actually the bulk of the retirements. I think it was only CJ and the Williams, as John has rightly said, that retired in the first instance. But actually, I think it was Sean's recovering car which caused the issues for a lot of the cars further back.
Yeah, you could, like, where obviously the camera is picking up the front runners, you can see in the background just this massive gaggle of cars just flying about everywhere, where obviously Busman Sean's trying to recover, or he's, from where he's first hit, might have DNF'd on the spot, and these cars just sort of been collected by others. But just, it was a lot of carnage all at once, and I think the only guy really got away with it was Dan's car, because he started ahead of it all.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the top three of Marco, Danskar and Erland managed to get away. They were already ahead of the incident when it started happening. And Dom, watching this back, Dom managed to weave his way completely through all the carnage and find himself in P4 afterwards. And he probably just sitting there thinking all his Christmases had come at once.
Yeah, just absolute madness. I think the thing that really sums that crash up the best is because there were so many cars wiped out at that stage, CJ, because he got furthest down the track, was actually still classified in ninth. So still, I think, managed to pick up 4 points,
4 points
from the incident. So very helpful for him. Luca, on the other hand, was able to recover and made his way onto the podium. So, it just shows that, luck sometimes does go your way, but you still got to make the most of it. But here we have 2 races back to back. Admittedly, the second one is tricky to, you can't pinpoint any blame on it really. It's wet conditions. But we've had 2 races where our title rivals have clashed together, back to back, and let's be honest, the person at the time who's leading the championship has come off worse of it. If you were CJ now, would you be a little bit rattled, maybe?
Oh, definitely. I think definitely on that one. I mean, you've had one race where your title rivals kind of pushed you to the edge of the track and cost you probably a few points, which would have put him 34 points clear, and then it would have
been a 6-point swing, wouldn't it? If it had been the other way around.
Swing, yeah. Instead of 28-34, and then Brazil wiped out the first lap, had your title rival go take second place. He's cut the gap in half. Suddenly, if I was CJ, I would be getting pretty concerned, a bit agitated that things just seem to be going against me at the very last minute, and that Luca, who, going into that race week, it was possible for CJ to actually win the title in Brazil if things had gone his way, but it had gone completely different. And all of a sudden, from what looked like a good week could have won in the title, suddenly he's in a massive scrap with Luca into the last 2 races, and the momentum is all going to Luca. I think it would have probably played around in CJ's head a little bit, and it would have agitated him a lot, and he knew he needed to do something to stem the tide before he lost the chance to win the title.
Would it have been just the sudden lack of momentum there? All of a sudden, having two races where you've sort of you've not been doing badly, but not been doing great. I mean, he's come off the back of what was 7 podiums in a row. Mexico is 8th, and then suddenly not be on the podium. That's a bit of a dent in the confidence as well, I'm sure, for a driver at the top of the championship who just wants everything to go smoothly.
Yes, you want, as the champion in an ideal world, you want everything to go smoothly, but the reality is sometimes stuff goes wrong, and good champions can recover from that quite quickly and get themselves back on top of it and make it not seem that bad in the end.
Yes. So at this point, we've got the gap cut down to 14 points. So CJ has seen his pointless advantage, come from 31 to 14 in just a matter of 2 races. Erland's gone on to win the Brazilian Grand Prix. Fantastic performance. I can't remember for the life of me what happened to Dan's car. I can only assume he had a mistake or an issue and he went off. Because he was in quite a commanding position at the end of that sort of first lap, really. So that is our 10th winner of the season after 20 rounds, which is fantastic. And we've got a 14-point difference coming to the last 3 races. Now, this was when we used to have 21 races on the official Formula 1 calendar, so we used to have an additional race put in, which happened to be France. And if we look back when France first came around in the year, we had typically a Sean Grant pole position, a Joe Sayer win, a Barry second place, and CJ on the podium. So would you have thought that then CJ would have been going into this race with a bit of confidence, knowing that last time they were here, his now title rival wasn't even on the podium?
I think yes, ultimately. I just looking back now at what happened for that race, I don't actually even think Luca turned up for that one. I think it might have been one of the races he missed because he did have a tendency to miss a few. But CJ would have got into that probably thinking, I've had a podium there. My teammate won the race. We could probably work as a team, get up to the front of the field, beat Luca, get the gap extended because, Joe has already proven that he could be the quickest of all there. And he could play the team game, let CJ go by. CJ gets the win. Joe gets second place. Best Luca could do is third with a 14-point gap. That would have meant going into the final round. CJ's got a 24-point lead, and that is it.
Yeah.
He would only need to finish 12th to win the title.
And you mentioned the team game there. We have to remember as well that the Renault and Sauber, as they were called then, constructors title battle was still going on. Dom, who we haven't really mentioned so far, had a great start to the season after the first 3 rounds, finishing the podium twice. Never really appeared for the rest of the season. Don't know what happened to his form. And Joe, as we said, has already taken a race win this season, been sort of there or thereabouts on the podium a couple of times. There was still a live constructors fight going on as well at the time.
Yeah, and I think at that point, Renault were the ones just a little bit behind and had the work to do, so they really needed to go into what is ultimately their home race and put on a show for the French fans and get the ground back on the Sauber team. Because, Dom, he wasn't right at the front, but he was still picking up decent, solid points. He was still, I believe, top 5 in the championship at the time. So he was doing a good enough job as teammate to Luca to kind of help the Sauber effort along, and it really was all starting to go on to Renault and CJ to really deliver at the French round.
Yeah, definitely. So last week, 2 rounds, 14 points, and France comes along then. So before this race, as we said, CJ was probably feeling a little bit confident. Coming to qualifying, Sean Grant puts it on pole position. He's recovered from his mortifying moment, shall we say, at Brazil, which is, you can only compare it to the David Coulthard in Spa 98 moment that happened. And he wants for himself, obviously, a decent result. He hasn't won a race this season. He's put it on pole other times. And we've then obviously got our championship rivals. So France, in the sort of grand scheme of things, of the season when the second time around wasn't the most entertaining race. But Luke will remember it fondly because it was he won the race and cut the gap to 1 point. CJ only taking fourth place. Now, for a man who earlier on in the season was on the podium, to miss out on the podium now while his title rival has won it, what does that do to you? What sort of mindset does that put you in?
I think it really just starts to get to you a lot. There's a lot of pressure being handed on. You have massive points leads just being eaten away in the space of a few rounds, and I think it will be doing a lot to him because now, instead of being, comfortably ahead, he's now in basically a winner takes all battle into the final round. Whoever finishes ahead out the two of them will win the title. And I think what happened in France that really ultimately cost CJ was that qualifying was a bit mixed in terms of weather. I mean, I'm just going through it.
I remember now,
third,
yes, actually.
Luca fourth. CJ was 8th. He was 5 seconds off because the track dried at the very end of the session. And that meant the cars that went out at the very end of the session were on the best track conditions, and CJ got caught out, while Luca not so bad. But, he was 4th, Joe was 3rd, and the chance is still there for the team game to happen. Like, Joe could hold Luca up and allow CJ to catch up, but straight away on the opening lap, Chiapelli just got the move done on Joe, and then from there he never really looked back.
Yeah, because from memory, Dan's car was getting involved at that point as well in the race, and sort of got himself up into a sort of podium position just behind the likes of Chiapelli, and I think Sean had actually had a good first lap for once and held on to his lead. But you had the Renaults both still in the top 6. Dom had an awful first lap from memory and was right down the back. But Owen, so you've had a bad first lap. You're down in 6th. Your title rivals in 2nd behind the most inconsistent driver in the league we've probably ever seen. At that point in the race, so early on in a track that's not very difficult, not very easy to overtake even. What's your mindset for the rest of the race then?
Yeah, CJ. Yeah, not. Again, your title rival's beating you again in another race. It's 3 races on the bounce now that he's going to be beating you. So you need to think to yourself, what's going wrong? Like, what am I doing? You need to just sort of need to put more effort in, to be honest, if you're getting slapped up by your title rival quite comfortably at this point in the season.
And so CJ did pull it back, as we said, and was able to finish 4th. Luca came away with the win. And now we head into a title rival where there's 1 point difference. Now, this is not the first time in TGP2 history that, it's gone down to the wire in the last race, or even that there's been a 1 point gap. There's been some where it's been even less. There's been other 1 point differences as well. And we are left with then a case where we've got both championships open, both of Luca and CJ obviously in the running for the title. We've got Renault and Sauber in the hunt for the Constructors' Championship. So you really, as a team and as a driver, you want a nice, solid qualifying session to put yourself in a good place to deal with the challenge ahead. And weirdly, this time, it was Luca that was on the rocks coming into it, as he only put his car in 6th for qualifying, and CJ was in the top 3 along with his teammate.
Yes, Lucas suddenly had the tables turned on him. CJ had a really good qualifying. Joe right behind him on the grid, so they could play the team game. There was a bit of a team game down at Sauber, but they were down a bit further down the grid. They were 6th and 7th at the start of that race. Bossman Sean, once again, the most inconsistent man in TGP2, is on pole position. So it was all setting up to be quite a corker. Chiapelli having to make up his way through the field, and CJ just trying his best to maintain position and hope for the best.
Yeah. So CJ got an okay start from memory and was right on the back of Sean. But it was Luca who got the dream opening lap, or at least opening half of the lap, as he jumped straight up to third. And I think, actually, from memory, CJ took the lead very briefly from Sean.
Yes, CJ did very briefly take the lead, but I think Sean managed to get it back towards the end of the first lap. And I think what helped Luca with the open lap as well was at the first corner, Bazza tried to go around the outside of Joe, and they locked wheels and both cars went off the road. And that allowed Luca to just sneak through and take the position. So Joe came back on the road, and it was incredibly close for being an accident with Luca. Luca just managing to hold around the outside to gain up to fourth, and I think he managed to get third on Dan's car because Dan's car made a mistake and ran wide.
Yeah.
So that ultimately allowed Luca to get between the two Renaults on the opening lap of the race.
Yeah, well, from memory, Joe actually came back at Luca on that main straight at the same time that CJ was overtaking Sean. So both Renaults making a move. And then over the next 5 corners, we had Luca pull off a fantastic manoeuvre around the outside of Joe at the end of the second straight. Really, really good late braking, getting it round the outside, and putting Joe off a little bit on the exit as well, sort of turning a little bit extra than maybe he needed to ensure Joe got out of it. And then just 5 corners later, Sean all over the back of CJ, and CJ locks up, goes right just before the hotel. Sean back into the lead, and suddenly, out of nowhere, from second and what was 6th on the grid, we have our title rivals right behind each other on track. This is shaping up fantastically at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, and it is literally going to come down to a winner takes all. The first guy across the line will win the championship. But CJ did have a bit of a gap over Luca. It was about nearly 3 seconds onto the third lap at the end of that 2 into lap 3. But it's where the thing that happened on lap 3 that kind of started to set the scene for the story that's about to begin was CJ managed to get himself a 3-second time penalty, just one corner cut too many. And ultimately, that meant Luca didn't actually have to overtake CJ to win the title. He just had to stay within 3 seconds. And I think that really put the ball in Luca's court, so to speak, because it meant that he had the knowledge knowing that if he stayed behind, if he did nothing silly and just followed CJ home, it didn't matter where they finished, unless, of course, they were outside the points. But as long as Luca followed CJ home within 3 seconds, the title was his, unless, of course, he followed suit and got a penalty of his own.
Well, that's always a risk at Abu Dhabi. It's very easy to make that sort of mistake. So both drivers pitted on lap number 5, trying to potentially do an undercut on Sean, who'd already got himself a good gap at this point. And they came out as they were, with Luca ahead of Chiapelli. Sean then, the lap later, decided to come into the pits and make his stop and actually still come out ahead of these guys and have a McLaren in between the two of them. At this point, though, CJ had side past Kim, who was out of sync with the rest of the field, and Luca was now stuck behind the Haas driver for a few more corners, which cost him a couple of seconds. But we had, at this point, all of our main protagonists, Sean, CJ, Chiapelli, and Joe, all having made their one and only stops at the end of lap number 6 then. So Luca put in a couple of great laps to get right on the back of CJ, and this is where it all sort of started getting a little bit tense, I think is probably the best word to use. There was some feisty defending, but there was also some feisty attacking, but it seemed just like a great title showdown at this point.
Yeah, it's definitely brewing towards that. We've got CJ just, at the starting lap 7, they were all 3 line astern. Sean was about 6 seconds in front, and then as the lap started, next couple of laps, you could start to see the gap beginning between Sean and CJ quite dramatically, because it was quite clear what the plan was from CJ from that point onwards. It was CJ was trying to back Chiapelli up into his teammate to get Joe in front, and then basically the two of them scarper after that.
Yeah.
But as we know, things didn't turn out that way.
No. So we'll pick up the action on about lap number 9, I think it was. So the gap now between the top two, as Owen rightly said, was 10 seconds. Now, Sean's a quick driver, but, a 10-second gap after 9 laps isn't really, or sort of, 8 laps coming on to lap number 9.
It was 4 after at the end of lap 6, it was 4 seconds the gap.
Yeah, so a 6-second increase isn't right. And as you rightly said, Joe closing in on the pair of them. So there was definitely a clear understanding at this point what might be about to happen. And it could have been a very good team tactic to play for Renault as well, couldn't it? Have both cars together on the track. And assisting with CJ getting the title. Get one of them in between Luca, who at this point wasn't able to overtake CJ. Secure the Renault the title in constructors and drivers. No?
Yeah, I think that was ultimately the plan, because you could clearly tell from the timing screens that the way Bossman Sean was getting away by something like 2 to 3 seconds a lap, that it was clear that CJ was starting to back Luca up towards Joe, which would have allowed Joe to get past Luca, CJ to scarper away, get the 3-second buffer, whilst Joe held up Luca to allow CJ to win a championship. It was actually, there's nothing in the rules against it.
No.
It would have been very, very clever play, and ultimately, it could have won Renault the Constructors as well.
It would have been very reminiscent of Hamilton tried to do it in 2016 to Rosberg.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
We could have gone quicker. So lap number 10, Luca finally tried a move at the end of the second straight, and it just didn't quite happen. But that lost so much time that in the end it put Joe to just over a second behind. And there was a real sense there that something more could happen. And I think that was the point then where the first real contact was made. Between the title rivals. We had the triple right-hander, obviously, not long after that, just before the hotel. And there was, I'm not even going to call it half an opportunity, it was a quarter of a chance for Luca. And I think maybe he snatched his brakes a little bit as well. Had to send it up the inside of CJ. There was a little bit of contact. They both run wide. Again, at this point, is this just pressure boiling over into something, or is this a sense now that there is more than just frustration going on?
I would say at this point, I think it was just a lot of pressure. Both these guys are going for their first ever title, and Luca just snatched the brake a little bit. He has to swerve to avoid CJ's car, gets down the inside, and ultimately there is a bit of contact made, and both cars run wide, which allowed Joe to get right in on the action. I think the argument that could have been made, though, was that CJ, with the backing up, did lift off very early into that corner. Probably, he's more towards the middle of the circuit rather than the left-hand side, which is more the optimum line. He's just trying to put the car in the right spot to hold Luca up so Luca can't make a move or anything like that. But in this case, the closing speeds of the two cars are so vastly different that Luca misjudged and had to swing it down the inside. And I think that probably really annoyed CJ, because CJ up to that point had been doing it all absolutely fine. He'd been going slowly, but he was doing enough without any contact or anything, just to back Luca up, allow Joe to close in and play the team game. But I think it was here where the gloves started to come off a little bit, I feel.
Yes.
Yeah, you could definitely think that, because if you see a few quarters later, what actually happens is CJ just sticks it up the inside at the final corner, and they both go off there as well. And then at turn 1, Chiapelli basically nearly runs into the back of CJ again, has to overshoot turn 1, and that lets Joe completely into the mix because he passes Chiapelli, and then that's when it really started to get tasty.
It did. Well, fortunately for Luca, he was behind Joe for only a couple of corners, and then at the hairpin made a bold move up the inside. Joe got a really good run, but then thanks to Mr. John putting it in a wall, there was a virtual safety car when Joe had a really good run on the Sauber. And from memory, I think it lasted both the DRS straight. So Luca got a real get out of jail free card from there. So that allowed him an extra lap, really, of breathing room. Back ahead of Joe, who really was in this battle now. And at this point as well, the Mercedes was starting to come into it. Bazza was being drawn in. This is how slow they were going. Bazza's gap to Joe before them was huge and already coming down. But then what happened over the next 3 laps sort of got worse, didn't it?
Yeah, and I think it all came from the VSC. Right at the end of the VSC, it took so long, the VSC, that they were back under the tunnel by the time it started to go. But at the end of that VSC, Joe went into the back of Luca, damaging the wing. And I think that was more image judgment, because I think the VSC was just ending. And then it all really started to kick off at the end of that lap.
Well, yes. So there was, unseen by the cameras, there was some sort of move between Luca and CJ, which ended up in them both making contact and spinning wide. And Joe had gone from 4th to 2nd, and now it was complete roles reverse. We had Joe in 2nd, Luca in 3rd, and CJ in 4th. This was now massively backfiring for CJ and Renault. So now it was Joe's job to be the roadblock, wasn't it?
On lap 12, yeah, Joe was in the front at the start. They both CJ and Chiapelli had DRS, and I think Joe lifts off early, completely catches Chiapelli off by surprise, and he just lunges it round the outside, going into the chicane at the end of the first back straight, and it all gets quite interesting there. He goes through polystyrene boards. He got CJ one side of Joe, so basically they do the old Ricardo's on from 2000, and basically Hakkinen one side, Schumacher's the other side. They both go past Joe like Zonda, and then it all gets tasty on the exit.
Yeah, well, this is how it starts, really, wasn't it? Yeah, Joe being very defensive, rightly so. He's not meant to be there. At the end of the day, he's meant to be the one in 4th. The one in 3rd, and his teammate's meant to be where he is. So Luca tries his squeezing tactic again on CJ from memory, and gets past him. Luca, as you said, massively outbrakes himself. Joe and him all run wide. There's contact again. There's front wing everywhere. Bazza's now in the mix of it, who jumps into 2nd and goes on and comfortably takes it, while these 3 are now scrapping still, but just lower down in the points all of a sudden.
Yeah. And Bazza.
Yeah, Bazza. Yeah, like I think everyone was about to say, Bazza just really came in, spoiled the party, and just took off. He literally just went clean running outside of Luca and Joe. I almost dropped it in front of him, and then, by the hotel, he'd actually already got past CJ up to 2nd, and CJ didn't really put any sort of fight up against him either. So Bazza gained, I think, 4 seconds of the lap, made 3 overtakes, and was ahead by about 2 seconds by the end of the lap.
Yes. So lap 13 came around. We had CJ and Luca still battling very hard. More contact was made, this time around the outside of turn 3, involving both of them going incredibly wide and using what can only be described as an imaginary Abu Dhabi circuit layout. But the 3 of them still somehow all in this battle together. Separated by less than a second. Joe then moved up to 3rd, obviously. CJ tried to put a move on him with what can only be described as next to no front wing left. Obviously went straight on. Chiapelli went back ahead of Joe, and it was just this sense of this mess that was becoming, and everyone could see it happening.
It was getting quite... From a neutral's perspective, I guess you could say comical would probably be the word to use. It was getting very interesting. We got everyone basically, because you go to the next chicane, Joe's making up his own lines, then you get to the next chicane, one of them's made up his own lines again, completely outbreaking himself. It's like they didn't really know what the circuit looked like anymore. It's just like, oh, that looks like tarmac, we'll use that. It's like, they haven't built the rallycross circuit yet, or Abu Dhabi. You don't have to use it.
No, I mean, in one respect though, we had a lap and a half to go, and we still didn't know who was going to win the title. So, on a sort of more positive note, and the unpredictability side of it, it was fantastic entertainment. Just lacked a lot of other things. But so with a lap to go, we had Dan's car suddenly move up into fourth. We had Chiapelli in third, now 2 places clear of his tyres of rival, but none of them had any grip left really anymore, thanks to no front downforce. I think Luca had completely lost his front wing at this point.
The two of them, yeah. Well, going on to the just coming into the triple right-hander, basically CJ did the lift off early tactic, and Chiapelli had nowhere to go but in the back of him, and that's why he lost his front wing.
Yeah.
And at this time, you know, we were saying at the start of it all, it was a 10-second gap to Bosbed Short. By this point, it had pretty much risen to 30 seconds.
Yeah.
In the 5 or 6 laps that they had been scrapping. Such was the aggressive tactic that Renault were putting out to try and get Joe ahead of Luca. And that's towards that's the start of the final lap. I was just reading it back of the video. It says 14 of 14, but because of where they are on the track, it looks like they're on the last lap, when actually it's just Sean just going through turn 1 to start it.
Yeah. No, carry on.
No. I was just going to say it was just at that point where Dan's car managed to get in, but I think you did just already mention that, so apologies.
No, don't worry. So the race ended on a bit of a somber note, shall we say. It was incredibly I was in the commentary box with Andy, and we felt robbed. I think was the best phrase to put it. So, you know, at this point we'd already forgotten about what was actually quite exciting with CJ's penalty and how that was going to come into play by what was happening. But Joe, you know, naturally led his teammate through in the end. So he finished fourth on the road, but after penalties, actually ended up behind Luca anyway because of that. So I think the final order was Chiapelli 5th, CJ 6th, and Joe 3rd.
Well,
Dom
actually,
had a shocker.
Yeah, James gets through on the final couple of corners.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think he had penalties himself as well, so took himself out of contention, because if he had ended up obviously in between them and, you know, penalties had maybe gone CJ's way, then CJ could have ended up winning that. But Dom had a shocker and finished in 12th, only picking up 1 point, but Sauber were able to clinch the Constructors' title as well. Was that just because Renault's tactic before of getting, you know, Joe ahead, slowing them up, actually in the end just cost them everything?
Yes, ultimately, because the tactic led to both Mercedes getting through, and both Mercedes have comfortably ahead by the end of that. You know, there was no chance that they were going to catch them back up. And the McLaren of James as well getting involved in the last lap. Actually, I think he managed to finish between the two Renaults and ahead of Luca at the line. So I think they crossed the order with CJ, James, Joe, then Luca. Obviously, the penalties to the two at the front, meaning that it was Joe in 4th, Luca 5th, and then the other two behind. But ultimately the tactic really did cost them, because while they were up on the bigger points, there was a chance they could have had 2nd or 3rd, would have been 33 points, and, you know, Alpha would have got 13. It would have been a 19-point swing. It possibly could have done it.
I think it would have done by a couple of points, yeah.
Yeah, but ultimately, the amount of time they lost, the likes of Baz and Dan's car making it through, it ultimately did cost them the Constructors.
Yeah. So we had everything coming into this race. We had a fantastic season, which had been unpredictable. 10 winners in the first 21 races. A great title showdown with 1 point separating. You know, two people who have actually been part of TGP for a long time, coming together in what we thought was going to be a classic race. I still feel we were robbed in that final round of what could have been something pretty special. I mean, both of you looking back on it as well now, if it hadn't have happened, if Renault hadn't have had that tactic, CJ had already said at this point that, you know, the Mexico incident had made him, you know, think a certain way towards how he was going to approach things with Luca. So was Mexico the reason why this happened? Or was it just that everything came together in a certain way, which meant that this race had to finish like it did?
Well, it didn't have to finish like it did. They just decided it was going to finish it. They made their own decision to make it finish like it did. They didn't have to end like that at all. Yeah, if they'd raced normally, you probably see Chiapelli would probably still won the title because of CJ's penalty, and Chiapelli was all over the back of him before it all started going to absolute toots.
Yeah, I'd have to agree on that. And I mean, going over the course of the season, Luca won 7 races, CJ just won 3. He had more than double the wins. He missed a couple of weeks as well, where he couldn't make it for whatever reason. So you got to remember, he didn't do all 22 races like CJ did. And, that probably meant he did something close to 18. He missed, I think it was the first French round, so I think he missed week 4, he missed week 7. And, in those weeks, France, CJ got the podium. Week 7, CJ was first and second across the 2 races. So, he really did the damage when Luca couldn't make it. But when they were both on the track together, more often than not, Luca was the one ahead. So I think over the course of the season, Luca was the right guy to win the title and deserved it.
So, post-race, a lot of an influx of opinions came in, and it led to, I think, 2 of the harshest penalties we've seen in TGP history being given to the Renault drivers, with Joe given a 2-week ban, and I think from memory CJ being given at least a season ban, if not longer.
And he was disqualified from the championship as well, like Schumacher in 97.
Yeah. So a real disappointing end to what was a really good season, actually. A massive shame. And we've got to look back and think, okay, well, it surely now in seasons to come can't get worse than this. At least this will go down as one of the most remembered seasons we've had in all of TGP, across 1, 2, Project Cars and Dirt. And I hope that we won't see something like this again. There was a lot of positives to take from the season, don't get me wrong, but it was certainly ruined by the finale. So thank you very much for joining me, and we will be here next week for a reminiscent of Season 20 of the TGP1 title, where we had a 4-way title fight. It's been a pleasure, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.